Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you can all join us today. And if you are listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you can find the Lunch Hour, you can always check us out in the studio on our YouTube channel. Leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment. And if you are watching us on YouTube, you can take us with you wherever you go on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you can find the Lunch Hour. As always, word of mouth is wonderful, so let your friends and family members friends know all about the Lunch Hour podcast. Very excited for our guest who's joining us today, talking about an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I met her a couple of weeks ago, inauguration weekend, in fact. Her name is Brenda Hafera. She is the Assistant Director and Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation's Simon Center for American Studies. She previously served as the Director of International and Continuing Education at the Fund for American Studies and Assistant Director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good at Villanova University. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, a Bachelor of Science in Finance, and a Master's in Political Science from Villanova. She was a Publius Fellow at the Claremont Institute and a James Madison Fellow at Hillsdale College, which means that she's got a brain which is much, much bigger than mine. Brenda, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So listen, let's start here because you've done a lot of writing on the issue of patriotism. And I think I may have mentioned, I came of age 1976, I turned 5 in 1976, which will now let everybody know how old I actually am. But 1976 was a very important year for me. It was the year my parents started taking me around to places like Bunker Hill, and I started learning about the Revolutionary War. And of course, it was the bicentennial. And we had Schoolhouse Rock on ABC teaching us about No More Kings and the Three-Ring Circus of Government. But things changed, and we can talk about whether or not it's by design. I think it was, but we've got a real crisis in patriotism in America, don't we?
Unfortunately, I think that's true. And part of it, as you allude to, is because we haven't done a good job of telling our story anymore, right? When you were being raised, you would go to these places, and that's part of how we educate ourselves is through our historic sites, through our museums, the battlefields, all those sorts of things. And we don't tell the stories anymore. When you go to a lot of these places, there's a distorted version of history. And this has been kind of a long time coming. So the term that's been used has been the Great Awakening, right? Since about 2014, there's been a lot of these efforts that have really changed our origin story of everything from the 1619 Project. The Southern Poverty Law Center has a lot of curriculum, and that has started to infiltrate these public sites as well.
And we're gonna get more into that. It's funny because I have a friend who said that essentially the most boomer 15 minutes of radio ever was the 15 minutes that my broadcast partner Jerry Rogers, who's the editor of RealClear Policy, he and I years ago had never heard the word woke. And we heard it in a clip on an MTV thing, and we're like, "What is that word?" And then we spent the next 15 minutes trying. What are they saying? What's woke? And clearly we had missed that. But I think that's a good way to put it. Let's take a step back because I think you're like me in that you hold. Now I went to William and Mary. A lot of folks know this. I don't talk about it a lot in the air, but I like to say that at William and Mary, it's not a religious institution. But if William and Mary had a religion, it would be history and tradition. I view these things in that way, almost with I will say, a religious fervor. I have faith in this nation. I think you share that. How did you come to your abiding love and respect for not just history, but American history, who we are as a people?
Yes, so part of it was just how I was raised. I think my parents instilled in me a sense of gratitude And I'm one of 5 kids, so that also helps teach you that you're not the center of the universe, and you're not necessarily the source of all the gifts that you've been given. There's a sense of that. So it's how I was raised. And then when I got to college, when I went to Villanova, I was very fortunate to have some mentors who began to teach me political philosophy, which I'd never learned in high school. I went to a public high school. And I just fell in love with it. And I was very fortunate to one of those mentors is an American founding scholar. She's a Madison scholar. And I started reading the Federalist papers, and reading the Lincoln Douglas debates was my first inlet. And the Lincoln Douglas debates are just profound, right? And they are debating things that really matter, right? It's really the debate about all men are created equal, and slavery and the implications that has for a nation. And so I just fell in love because despite all our setbacks and all our failures, this is a good country. I mean, we're incredibly fortunate, and that was re-emphasized to me. I did some work overseas in Hong Kong and Greece, and to see, what the Hong Kongers are struggling for and fighting for in 2019, their freedoms. And if you study international history, you really do get a sense of America is unique, right? There is a promise to be able to live a life of human dignity in America that has not been there for most of human history, and is still not there in many countries.
Well, we're a people bound together by principles as opposed to a shared physical or language heritage, right? I mean, that's the concept that all men are created equal. I mean, that's obviously it was revolutionary at the time. In fact, let's talk about the revolution. Let's talk about the last 50 years. Because, the bicentennial, as I said, very important to me in 1976. We're now coming up on the 250th anniversary. What do we call it? The
semi-quincentennial.
Wait. Say it again.
Semi-quincentennial.
Semi-quincentennial. I'm going to keep saying that because I'm going to butcher it again. The semi-quincentennial. A lot has changed. So much has changed in the last 50 years. It's almost like, it's so funny because if you go back, I don't know if you ever read Peanuts by Charles Schultz, Snoopy, Charlie Brown, etc. Mm-hmm. Apparently, this is a little bit before my time, apparently there was a big celebration of the centennial of the Civil War. I mean, everybody was sort of infused with a discussion in the 1960s about where we were as a nation 100 years after the Civil War. 10 years later, we come to, the bicentennial. Here we are 50 years later. Obviously, we didn't do much about the 250th anniversary of the Civil War, maybe a little bit of stuff. But what has changed in terms of the popular mindset? How did this great awakening happen? I mean, obviously, I have my theories about outside forces pushing it on the United States. Not that I want to get all conspiracy theory minded, but there are folks who don't want us to be bound together by these common principles. How do we get to where we are?
Yeah. So I think I want to distinguish between the general American public and sort of a small but very vocal and powerful minority. And I think we saw this in the past election as well, that I think most everyday Americans love their country and think America is a good place. They realize that we have our failures and our setbacks, but overall are grateful for this country and are really tired of the efforts to vilify America and say that that it's in its origin is a unjust country, right? So I think it has been mostly a concerted effort of very particular groups. It started with our higher education institutions. They have educated the educators, right? And those educators have then gone into the classroom and spread things like critical race theory, anti-racism, those sorts of things. So the Great Awakening started around 2014, and since then really picked up and gained momentum. So a lot of these efforts of, in Colonial Williamsburg, in at Montpelier, those sorts of places. 2017, it started infiltrating. The 1619 Project came out in 2019. The Southern Poverty Law Center had a lot of its curriculum for a long time. And just to give one example, so the American Alliance of Museums, which has 35,000 members in 2020, yeah, it's and that's both individuals and museums, curators, those sorts of things. In 2022, they came out with a report which was co-chaired by the head of the Smithsonian, and that report begins that DEAI is integral to museum excellence, full stop.
Wait, tell me. What's the A in DEAI?
Accessibility.
Oh, okay, got it. All right, sure.
Right.
Okay.
Whatever acronym you're using, it's all the same.
It seems to me if they've been smart, I mean, obviously they wanted to start with the D, but they should have gone with IDEA because, you go to inclusive, diversity, equity, and accessibility, and you got a nice, I'm all about the cute acronyms, but okay, DEAI. All right, go ahead. So the Smithsonian, the head of the now wait, remind me, is the head of the Smithsonian, is that a federal government employee?
Lonnie Bunch.
Yeah. Okay, but that's someone who is
yes.
within the federal government. Okay, because this gets into my whole of government approach to this stuff. But go ahead. So they send out this report that says what?
So they say that museums should champion an anti-racist movement,
there you go.
And that DEAI is integral to museum excellence, full stop. So some of their priorities are then advocacy and anti-racism. Right. So there's this shift in the museum space from their purpose is to preserve our history and the legacy of individuals, their accomplishments, to they should really be engaging in advocacy.
It's interesting because we're going to get into the issue of Montpelier and we're going to talk about Colonial Williamsburg. I think you and I, when we sat down and were chatting the other day, I had raised the issue of the William Penn home site in Philadelphia, and maybe I didn't. But one of the things that I've been talking about for the last couple of years is what I call the whole of government approach to ideology and ideological goals, which is to say, there are, like, if we're going to re-educate the public, it used to be, we'll focus on what they're doing at the Department of Education. Well, now it's sort of, we're going to see how many different agencies we can do this in. And when it comes to things like the Great Awakening, as you're talking about here, it's things like removing the statue of William Penn from the William Penn Homestead site in Philadelphia as a way of taking a swipe at religious freedom, which we know the previous administration didn't like. But this is yet another way of doing it. And this is part of what we're talking about. And this sort of lends to what I'm talking about in terms of the focus is not on history, also not on promoting American values, but on promoting these other very radical ideologies. Am I right or wrong here?
I think that's right. And so it was the official education institutions have unfortunately already been captured for the most part.
Right.
So it's not, let's stop there. It's what's the next thing? So it starts with the official institutions and then it's museums and then it's a continual movement. And it's not just, unfortunately, I would say, government, it's also corporate partnerships.
Sure.
So the statues example, in 2022, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, which is the largest private donor for arts and humanities in the country, put social justice at the center of their grant-making initiatives.
Sure.
And they have dedicated $500 million to evaluating museums and monuments and transforming American history through monuments. And they're
if you're an educational nonprofit historical institution, I can't think of one that is nearby. I'm not going to mention it, but you're hurting for cash because your numbers are down. If someone's handing out $500 million in funding that's contingent upon implementing this kind of ideology, there's an incentive there. If you weren't already incentivized to go down this road, right? It creates huge perversions in the lessons that are being taught, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a little bit of a double-edged sword there
Right.
of these places are losing visitorships, they're losing private donations, but they're being propped up by some of these very large corporations with a lot of money and a social justice initiative. So George Soros Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the
Yeah.
Andrew Mellon Foundation, and these institutions, I don't think for the most part they really care about visitors and they really care about the sites themselves. It's about controlling the public narrative, right?
Right.
So I think they're willing to take a hit on some of these things because there's a larger purpose at work for them.
Right. Because we seem to have lost the thread. The importance of Colonial Williamsburg, yeah, I mean, it's about going and getting your ginger cake. It's about going and dipping candles. It's about going and seeing the blacksmith shop. But it's really about learning what we were talking about at the time, what the folks who were pushing a revolution there were talking about at the time, and the principles that were at work. The same thing with Montpelier, right? I mean, obviously, we want to talk about James Madison's life, but at the end of the day, it's really what he thought and what he was talking about and why that is important in the story of America, right? Because I guess it's this. If we start from the proposition that America is a nation of ideas, that what distinguishes us from other nations and what makes us an exceptional nation is that we are founded on ideas, talking about the personalities, which is, of course, my problem with the musical Hamilton, is that it's all about personalities and psychodrama and not about who Hamilton was and the debates between Hamilton and Washington and Jefferson about the formation of our government. If we start focusing on the nonsense, the personality conflicts, that's incredibly short-sighted, and it makes America short-lived as an idea, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agree with you.
I know there's a lot there. I'm sorry about that, but
yeah, sure. In a sense, it's not really about the founding fathers themselves. I think that's right. So
yeah,
I have tremendous amount of respect for James Madison, but in a sense, Montpelier's not even fully about Madison. It's about the Constitution, right?
of course,
That's
of
the
course,
symbol of what Montpelier is because
right,
James Madison was the father of the Constitution.
right,
He wrote many of the Federalist Papers. He presented the Virginia Plan at the Constitutional Convention. He wrote the Bill of Rights. So that is what he symbolizes for us. And that, I think, is why Montpelier is being targeted, because it's not actually about Madison himself. It's about these principles that we stand for as a nation. And the same with Monticello. Monticello is really not about Thomas Jefferson. It's
right.
about the Declaration of Independence. And so it's no coincidence that these two pillars, the Constitution and the Declaration, are sort of under fire.
And the awakening pushers, however you want to call them, the awokenists, they want to distill these sites into, and it's the same thing with all of them. Again, slavery is a black mark upon American history. We can, talk about the compromises that were made early on and how that affected us. But when they want to make these sites all about enslaved peoples. They want to, and it's true with Monticello, it's true with Montpelier, it's true with Colonial Williamsburg. That's the sum of the 1619 Project, right? At the end of the day, America's defining moment is about slavery, not about all of these other things, isn't it?
Right. So I think that is, everyone agrees that we should be talking about the importance of slavery, what slavery's impact was in America. Everyone agrees with that. But like you said, it's gone to this side where, to give a contrasting example, I think is helpful. So Mount Vernon talks about slavery. They don't shy away from it. They're matter of fact. This is part of the story. But they also talk about George Washington and his accomplishments, and that's not lost. And on the other side, we have Montpelier, where they say that's not enough to talk about the humanity and the contributions of the enslaved. You also have to unpack and interrogate white supremacy and white privilege. This is in their guidelines that they present. They're very upfront about this. And one of the things that these folks will say is that slavery is not our original sin, it's our origin. That is a line that's paraphrased in the 1619 Project, in the SPLC curriculum, and was written by a man who is now the current chairman of the board of Montpelier, who is also the podcast host for the Southern Poverty Law Center. So it's all very interconnected. It's a small group of people that seem to be infiltrating all these places. And so that's the shift. It's not that slavery is part of the story and we're striving towards all men are created equal. It's that this nation at its core is based in slavery. That's the distinction.
It's funny. I did a version of a crossfire show that they do out of Baltimore. I had a debate and discussion with somebody a couple weeks ago, right after the first of the year. I don't know about you. I mean, you went to a public school. I went to public school until 10th grade, and then I switched schools for the last 3 years of high school. But I've been in public school for many, many years. And I was taught about slavery. I was taught about the ills of slavery, the evils of slavery. We had a very vibrant Black History Month curriculum in my public schools. I mean, I want to say you're I think a little bit younger than I am. You got the person I was debating claimed that he was never taught about slavery in his schools, and I find that incredible. And that nobody is being taught about slavery. Certainly, for the last 50 years, we've been learning about it. I mean, what was your experience? The same thing? I mean, has there been a dearth of teaching about the evils of slavery in our public schools?
I agree with you. I think at one point there probably was. Peter Wood discusses this in his book, 1620, and looks at the textbooks and says, there probably needed to be a recalibration at a certain point. But we've moved beyond that, right? It has been recalibrated for quite a long time.
I think anybody who grew up watching either the original or the remake of Roots, and not that we need to get into a debate about the historic accuracy of Alex Haley's book, but nevertheless, I mean, if you watched Roots in the 1970s, and then I think they remade it in the 1990s or early 2000s, you got a pretty good understanding about why slavery was evil. Again, not that that's the end all be all. You've written about something that you call the thesis of civilization level crisis. Well, talk about that, but talk about that also in the context of what's happening in places like Montpelier and Colonial Williamsburg.
So the civilization level crisis is about what's going on with young boys and men in America.
I know there's a leap here that I want to make here, but the point is sort of as we go through this reconfiguring of historic perspectives, I think it's all bound together. I guess that's the point that I was making as I write this down.
So I would say that
but also talk about the thesis and then tie it all in.
Right. So the that piece is really examining the ways boys and men are struggling in America and throughout the world, academically, socially, in terms of their health, all those things. So like the second leading cause, for example, of death for men in America under 45 is suicide. Men who grow up without both their parents are more likely to spend time in prison than to graduate from college. So it's just devastating. And once you see it, it's everywhere. But I think the tie to what's going on is there's a crisis of meaning and purpose in America and in much of the West. There's a sense of people don't know who they are anymore, right? Of the sources, the things that we used to care about and be willing to lay down our life for, God, family, and country. There's a sense that those things are gone or they're out of reach for a lot of young people who feel very atomized and disconnected. So 15% of men say they have no close friends. So that's part of, there's a sense of a lack of meaning, a lack of purpose, a lack of a sense of I'm part of this greater project and can contribute to it. And so that's where I think the narratives that tear down America are actually part of it, of I'm not part of this grander project that depends on my choices and depends on consent of the governed, that I should find identity in my chosen characteristics like sexual identity, in race, in gender, those sorts of things. And I think people are ultimately finding that very dissatisfying.
Does it matter if it's by design or unintentional? I mean, I'm inclined to think that it does, insofar as understanding the motive of the folks who are driving this is important to defeating it. But at the end of the day, it needs to be defeated. Where do you come down in all this?
I think it does matter because it's harder to recover if it's intentional.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And actually, if we were honest about our nation's history, about our origin story, it's an incredible story, right? So in a sense, it has to be intentional.
Yeah.
Because if you were honest about what America means, right, you alluded to the Federalist Papers, it seems to have been reserved to this country to prove basically that human beings are capable of self-government.
Right.
And once you actually understand that history and that America is based around these principles, and that's never happened in human history, traditionally societies have been formed around religion or ethnicities, and this is a unique thing. You have to have some sense of, one, gratitude for the people who made that possible for you, and two, a sense of, I would say, proper pride that you have ownership in this experiment. And so if we were honest and actually studied our history, we knew these things, I don't think we would be in this sort of crisis. And so it has to kind of be a deliberate effort.
Right. I mean, it comes down to this idea of, if you don't understand that principle and what was driving these debates. And again, getting back to my real problem with, and I wrote a review of Hamilton, a couple of years after somebody, or not a couple of years, but right after someone had written a review, sort of taking a swipe at the music of Hamilton. I said, you're missing the point. The problem with Hamilton isn't that it's fake rap or whatever you want to call it. The problem is, unlike 1776, which I don't know if have you seen 1776?
It's been a long time.
Yeah. So we used to watch it every year. We did a screening a couple of years in a row of it. Again, it's one of my favorites, along with the Story of a Patriot, the Williamsburg movie. At least the authors and creators of 1776, they focused on the debates, the philosophy at the time, as crazy as that sounds. It's the only musical where there's a 45-minute gap between songs, like the longest gap ever in it. Hamilton focuses on the psychodrama. But again, if you don't know who we are as a people and why we are defending these principles, they become that much easier to defend. And when the government steps in to take away your individual rights and serves to disempower you, you are less likely to protest. Again, it makes us much more sheep-like, I would think. Your thoughts here? It's a lot.
Yeah. I think if you don't have a sense of what you're defending, you're not going to defend it.
Well, you can't defend it,
right?
How can you? Yeah. Let's shift gears here a little bit, because it's not just men per se, but you've also written a great piece of, oh good Lord, now I'm going to butcher the title, about the Men of Steel. About the issue of industrialization or the environmentalism, right? Because it's something I've talked about, right? The creation of the Rust Belt was the natural end result. Now, granted, we had rivers catching on fire in Ohio, among other places. So something needed to be done in terms of environmental protection. But it's not as though that environmental protection didn't come without major costs. Again, to sort of tie these things together, the Men of Steel and the war on them, that also plays into this overall, frankly, emasculation of men, by the prevailing political narrative, not the prevailing, but one of the political narratives that's out there, a driver in the political narratives. Talk about the Men of Steel and talk about all this.
Right. So what's happening with boys and men, I would say, is hitting them at each stage of life.
Wow.
So
yeah.
it starts in childhood. Much of this is driven by a lack of fathers. That's the main driver overall of what's going on. About half of children in America grow up with both their parents, right? So it starts there, and then it can build momentum in our school system, which is not geared towards boys. It's not very good for children overall, but it's very challenging for children to sit still in a classroom for that period of time.
Right.
And we're starting to decline things like recess. So it hits on the education level. And then what the Men of Steel piece is on the employment piece, the adulthood piece. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, right? And it's very clear when you're driving through Pennsylvania which towns have recovered and which towns have not.
Right.
And recovered from the shift of, we have shifted from a domestic manufacturing economy to a global knowledge economy, right? That's the overall picture. And that shift in particular has hit men with a high school diploma or less the hardest. While their wages have gone down, the wages of college educated men have gone up.
You know, it's interesting because I spent the summer of '94. I spent a good chunk of that summer working in Palmerton, Pennsylvania, which at one point had been the zinc capital of the world. And you saw the, not just, the post 1970s, 1980s environmental onslaught and how that affected this town, but then how the regulations were affecting the town's recovery overall. It was fascinating here. So to bring it all together, what do we do to come back? I mean, the work that you talk about, the work that you're doing at the Heritage Foundation, I mean, we've identified the problem. We've identified the problem at places like Montpelier and Colonial Williamsburg. What do we need to do? How do we, regardless of whether or not this is all intentional, how do we reinstill the love of country, the love of the principles, right? And it's not the love of country, but the love of the principles on which the nation was founded. What do we need to do?
Well, a couple things. I would say, one, choose who you support, both in terms of your financial gifts and in terms of where you go. Mount Vernon is doing a very nice job of telling the American story and preserving George Washington's legacy. And so you can choose to go to Mount Vernon over Montpelier, for example. Yeah. A second piece I would say is to get back to reading and knowing the primary sources.
Yeah.
Right. So this is it's very difficult to evaluate text and know which texts are good versus bad until you look at, okay, are they relying on the primary sources?
Right.
And then it becomes quite obvious. For example, one of the ways that Montpelier is distorting the American narrative is that they ignore James Madison's own words about things.
Wow.
Right. So just to give one example, they say that the words slave and slavery never appear in the Constitution, which is true, but they're painting that in a negative light, right? And James Madison says that the delegates refused to put those words in the Constitution because they didn't want to instill the idea that you could have property in men.
Right.
Right. Or for example, they say that the clauses in the Constitution that are about suppressing revolts and domestic violence are about slavery. And they list 5 revolts, only 2 of which happened before the Constitution was written, and say, see, this clause is about slave revolts. But what James Madison said, and what many of the founders said, it was about Shays' Rebellion.
Right, of course.
Of course, because that had just happened. It was the forefront of their minds. And so they wanted the government to have this basic power of maintaining the peace. Right. So getting back to the primary sources really helps us evaluate these different narratives of our history.
And then it gets into the celebration and how we go about celebrating. I mean, that's why I am, buoyed that we've got at least a different set of leaders going into, are you going to say it again, the semi-quincentennial?
That's right.
Did I get it right?
America 250.
Well, yeah, I know, but I'll tell you a true story real quick. I was a student at William & Mary when William & Mary was getting ready to celebrate its 300th anniversary. And I would have thought that 300 would have been tricentennial, but they kept talking about the tercentenary. And when I first heard that term,
that's tough.
I thought it was terce and tertiary. Now, of course, I'm like 18, 19 at the time. So, God forgive me. But then I realized later on, or I was told later on, no, it's tercentenary means 300th anniversary. Yes, these are tough to figure out, but I go down that road. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about that. I mean, how are you going into this? Are they tapping you? I'm hoping to give advice and counsel on how to go into the 250. I mean, what's going on with this?
Well, I think it's to be determined still to see what exactly is going to happen. It's been a busy couple of weeks, and so
No,
I think
busy
they're.
No, I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah. So but there has been a clear message that we are celebrating America 250, right? It's not, that was a challenge. That was a conversation about, do we have anything to celebrate? And there were people who said, no, we don't.
Right.
And so it's now been made very clear, yes, we're going to celebrate 250 years of our history. I think the 1776 Commission will be renewed, which was a commission put under the first administration. And so, and much of there have been state commissions erected, as well as a national commission that is taking the stance that things really should be kind of ground up of bolstering what people are doing in the states. So I think there's a lot of room. There's a lot to do, bring in art, culture, all those sorts of things.
I wanna. There are so many places I want to be, in 2026 to celebrate it. I think it's a glorious time. It'll be a glorious time for folks to be around for it. So, listen, Brenda, when I first was conceiving of adding another podcast to my repertoire, I at one point was going to do a podcast I was calling Outside Interests. My listeners have heard me talk about this before, and the idea was, the folks who come on to talk about politics and policy, folks outside of DC, they don't know what they're up to. And so I thought, and they've got some really interesting outside interests. So now I've just folded it into this podcast. So when you're not doing this work, I mean, I have some suspicions as to what you might be doing, but who knows? You could be, playing a guitar in a metal band, and I don't know. Listen, I say this because I've got a good buddy who does tech policy. He plays harmonica in a blues band. So when you're not doing this work, what are some of your outside interests?
Well, this will probably not be a surprise to you. I still read a lot because I spend a lot of time on history and philosophy and that sort of thing for my work. I tend to go towards novels in my spare time. So Jane Austen is a continual favorite, right? I read her over and over again and just love her. And then I always think it's good to do physical things. So, I spend a lot of time exercising, that sort of thing, but also baking and cooking. I think those are important balances.
The two go hand in hand. If you're going to bake, you need to exercise to balance.
That's right. Unfortunately, yep.
Yeah. The folks who watch the podcast will note that I've lost a fair amount of weight this year, and part of it is cutting out the baked goods, or everything in moderation, as they say, including moderation. Brenda, how do folks find out more about the good work that you are doing at the Heritage Foundation?
You can go to the Heritage website, and my profile is Brenda Hafera, H-A-F as in Frank, E-R-A, and pull up all the recent articles that I've written.
Our guest has been Brenda Hafera. She is the Assistant Director and Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation's Simon Center for American Studies. As I've said, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can take us with you wherever you want to go on whatever fine podcast platform you happen to find your podcast content from. It's a butchered and tortured sentence there. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you can check out what's happening in the studio by going to our YouTube page, the Federal Newswire's YouTube page. We've got all kinds of good stuff. Jerry's Business of America podcast, the China Desk is also terrific. Little short subjects there. Subscribe, leave us a like, leave us a comment, and most importantly, let your friends and family members know, and your family members' friends know, how much you're enjoying the lunch hour. I am your host. I'm Andrew Langer. Have a great week, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.